Well, thank you so much, Teresa, for these for this really kind introduction. Thank you, Geertje and Teresa, for inviting me. It's really such an honor to be here. I just wish I could have listened to the speakers that came before me. You really have organized an outstanding program. Well, the pandemic. So Geertje has suggested that I talk for about 20 minutes about my book, Gendering the Renaissance Commonwealth, and then we can go and discuss the state of the field more generally, the field that is the history of political thought and gender. So, as Teresa mentioned, I'm a historian of political thought, and my book started a long time ago with an interest in the state and the woman question. I had always found it puzzling that there seemed to be no true political equality among the sexes in politics. I was working in politics a long time ago, and it was just so obvious that there was just no true political equality. And I decided to go to the roots of the modern state to see whether I could find the origins of this seemingly very stubborn characteristics that makes politics so male. What I then eventually came up with in this book was a very different story than the one that I set out to write, but I hope it's also an interesting and enlightening one. The book is called, as Teresa mentioned, Gendering the Renaissance Commonwealth, and that is because we generally locate the foundations of the modern state in the early modern world in the Renaissance. And of course this is an oversimplification, but bear with me for the remainder of this talk. In the Renaissance, the general narrative goes, lay the roots of our modern politics. Here we can find the foundations of the state, of the political, and of our modern modes of thinking around these topics. We are also told, be it in lectures or in the handbook literature, that birthing the modern state was an entirely masculine endeavor. Early modern thinkers either did not write about women at all, that is, they simply had no interest in mentioning them, or they strongly justified their exclusion from politics. A study on women and gender in the history of political thought could thus only produce a study of exclusion, a study in 3,000 years of misogyny. Secondary literature often claims that early modern writers excluded women from politics since women's space, the household, the domestic sphere, was apolitical. The Renaissance is held to have inherited from antiquity a concept of pure, uncontaminated politics, of active citizenship, of selfless and virtuous political self-realization, in which the individual fights for freedom against domination and for self-actualization. Women thus could not be included in thinking about politics because they did not belong to this political public sphere. The sphere of women, the private, rather was defined by everything that politics was not, by subjugation, by domination, by an absence of liberty. The general narrative of early modern European political thought is thus that of a grand dichotomy that divided the private and the feminine from the life of the public and the political, the masculine. This is supposed to ultimately come to us from the Greeks, particularly from Aristotle, and it was supposed to have then been revived in the Renaissance. Hannah Arendt uses this concept elegantly in The Human Condition, Habermas in The Transformation of the Public Sphere, and also J.J. Pocock work with this narrative model. It seems then, as I said earlier, that the only story about early modern politics and gender is one of a masculine sphere of politics and the exclusion of women from it. My book, however, tells a different story. I argue that rather than desperately looking for women in the public sphere and bemoaning that they weren't expressly included as active citizens, as magistrates and as political players, we need to question our underlying assumptions about the space, the sphere, and the placing of women as apolitical. The book explores how Renaissance readers interpreted Aristotle's characterization of the political and its relationship to the private sphere of the family. Next to well-known political thinkers like Niccolò Machiavelli, Leon Battista Alberti, and Jean Baudin, I mainly study commentaries on Greek and Roman philosophy to see how they understood the Greek concept of the separation of the spheres. they are commentators. When reading these commentaries on Aristotle's politics, his ethics, and his Oeconomica, but also on Cicero's, the Offices, or Roman law, it emerged that Renaissance thinkers drew on a very different Aristotle, on a very different Greek and Roman past than the one we know today. Rather than cementing the view that women inhabited a private and an apolitical world, early modern Aristotelian thinkers, I found, saw the private as highly political. Thinkers explore topics like friendship and animosity, love and compromise, and the struggle that comes with living closely alongside other people as political acts. The household and the life in the family was seen as part of the political sphere, and there were particularly ideas on marriage and on child-making and rearing that appeared as part of the genuine political nature of human beings. Commentators thought of the household as the beating heart of the city, that's what kept it alive. We generally find the affirmation that human beings were, quote, far more conjugal than civil, as Bernardo Segni wrote in the late 16th century. Mid of 16th century. Thinkers stressed that the political grew from the family, and it particularly grew from marriage. In a conjunction of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology, marriage was thought to be the first community, and as Cicero had written, it was the seminarium, the seedbed of the state. As Sixtus Birk, a Basel humanist, wrote, human beings are political because they are social. And implied here was that their sociability was expressed by their conjugality. Marriage, then, the union of husband and wife and the fundamental gender relationship, took on a central place for thinking about politics. Far from being a state of necessity without public consequences, marriage was styled as the very society from which politics became possible. Marriage, we see in the book, meant the origins of the state, but it also was the image of the state, and it signified also the best government available, and that is what made marriage so important for political theory. Therefore, the relationship of husband and wife was analyzed in its political significance in detail in early modern Europe. Despite what we often hear about the rather low status of the friendship between husband and wife in Aristotle's thought, early modern Aristotelians characterized the relationship of the couple as a friendship that involved virtue. And as Donato Acciaioli, a late 15th century commentator, wrote, quote, as Aristotle has shown most widely, both husband and wife are good and educated in their own way. The husband loves his wife vehemently, and he is loved by her, and delightful is their marriage, and delightful is the friendship between them. Marriage appeared as something beautiful and enjoyable, and commentators emphasized the mutuality of affection, quote, because virtue is the thing of both, and they delight in being similar, similes, in it, as Lefebvre d'Etaples wrote. The love and friendship and virtue that the married couple had was seen as deeply political. So that was not a private relationship, that was a political relationship, because commentators stressed that husband and wife were, in their enjoyment of each other, just like citizens in a city, who should feel love and friendship to each other and live together in virtue. Citizens were thus like husbands and wife. Indeed, Aristotle had written that all relationships in the household were like constitutions in a state. But while the relationship between children and parents, for example, was like a monarchy, husbands and wives were characterized as being in a so-called political relationship. That is, their relationship was statesmanlike. It was like that of citizens in a city-state, which was, crucially, a relationship of equals. In the late 16th century, the commentator Antonio Montecatini wrote that husband and wife were just like two magistrates, one higher in the hierarchy, one lower. Husbands and wives were then seen to jointly rule the household, like magistrates ruling a city. Their relationship was one of relative equality, or parity, as Montecatini wrote, just like two fellow citizens in the polity. That the gendered relationship of marriage was political in several senses, and what is more, that it was therefore also characterized as a relationship of equals and of equality, might somehow sound not quite right to us today, since we are often told that early modern people could not even conceive of the equality of the sexes. However, as Montecatini reminded his readers, already Plato had shown that men and women were equal. Equality of the couple was therefore well established by the 16th century. We here, however, also need to understand the alterity of past political concepts, which only seem like the ones we operate with today. Evidently, for early modern thinkers, there was no contradiction in writing that women were equals inside a hierarchical relationship. Early modern ideas of equality essentially were absolutely fine with difference and with hierarchy. Gender, and this is a point that I make throughout the book, lets us see this alterity and the historical contingency of political concepts very clearly, and it helps us in this way to make sense of them. This becomes also very clear when we reflect with gender on the content of early modern liberty, which was purportedly celebrated in the Renaissance. Women, as Jean Baudin liked to point out, were certainly amongst the free persons in the state, and that was simply a point of the law. But that did not mean that they could not be completely dominated by their husbands at the same time. So, liberty in Renaissance Europe did not necessarily mean non-domination, and paying attention to gender lets us see this clearly. The gendered relationship in its political significance was then negotiated and renegotiated throughout the Renaissance. Not only Republican thinkers, but monarchical and even absolutist thinkers like Jean Baudin directly engaged with the Aristotelian and Ciceronian tradition of the political importance of family and marriage. Jean Baudin, even more than his forerunners, stressed that the family was the building block of the state, which would simply die were it not repopulated by marriage. He, however, was adamant that marriage was not a conjunction of equals. Rather, as I've said above, he advocated that marriage was a state of absolute domination of wives by husbands. He stressed this so fervently because he thought that the very concept of sovereignty itself emerged from the relationship that a wife had to her husband, and that it was the image of this relationship. The very notion of sovereignty for this thinker required the strict gender hierarchy. Also, sovereignty at its core was a gendered concept. And thinkers were really clear about this. However, what now seems to us like the traditional view of the relationship in marriage, so the subservience of women, was actually, I think, an invention of a tradition, as I show in the book. Baudin here was severely criticized for it by contemporaries. Montecatini, for example, wrote that Baudin had here completely falsely interpreted Roman law and philosophy. Against Baudin, Montecatini affirmed that, quote, women were pares, partners or equals of their husbands, and half of the free population of the state, which therefore needed to be tailored to their demands too. So, but not only this Aristotelian tradition and Aristotelians dealt with family, marriage, and gender, I spend a lot of time in the book also on Machiavelli, and I see him as someone who intervenes into this debate on the value of the domestic life. And he does so by showing that the idea that a harmonious private life is the building block to harmonious polity, and I had called this earlier, this idea that marriage is the image of politics. So he argued that this idea of harmony in family and state was nothing more than kitsch. Machiavelli believed that daily life and politics were tumultuous and that they were characterized by struggle. But while Machiavelli thought that the political family life was mainly a breeding ground for corruption, he actually discussed women as political players in the public sphere, and he was convinced that they were up to the job. Indeed, at the core of his political philosophy, we find a gender dynamics, in the purported antagonism of manly virtue and female fortune. In my reading of Machiavelli, what are masculine and what are feminine traits appear actually highly fluid. And in Machiavelli's work, it's also quite clear who has the upper hand in the dealings of life and death in politics, and that is Fortune. Fortune is a woman, and we need to keep her under, he wrote, but he also wrote that it was Fortuna herself who decided who could keep her under. And after all, he was clear that it was Fortuna who helped men and women rise, and it was Fortuna that made them fall and go down under themselves. Regarding the relationship of the sexes, Machiavelli appeared not to be so sure whether in politics men would fare any better than women. So this is my very, very short overview about my book, and I just here wanted to sketch some moments that highlight why and how gender becomes pivotal for early modern political thought. Gender, defined as a relationship between the sexes, targeted the heart of the political in many ways. The gender relationship is crucial for all origin stories. The state was indeed birthed, and it is often birthed by women and men. Gender was not only important for the beginning, but also for the progress of the state. Marriage worked as the image of the state. It was vital for visualizing citizenship, and it was a benchmark when thinking about inclusion and exclusion of the citizen body and what that actually might mean. The gender relationship then showed the beginning, and it also showed the limits of politics. In the book, I show that women were not a category that automatically signposted political exclusion due to their biology, just as men were not political simply because of their biological maleness. The realities of the Italian, I'm doing this quite a lot, the realities of the Italian city-states certainly confirm this. Research shows that not only women, but the greatest part of all men living in a Renaissance Italian city were excluded from political participation, a fact that's actually very rarely mentioned in the history of political thought. Citizenship also was contingent on belonging to well-defined families. Citizenship then, at least in the Renaissance, was not about male individuals, but it was about family membership. Here, mothers also became important. Already Aristotle had written that the easiest way to identify a citizen was that someone was born from a citizen mother and a citizen father. And we can actually find something very similar in many legal codes of medieval and Renaissance cities. But that means that women were citizens too, and female citizens indeed existed. Some women were even heads of households, and we can see this from the census. Women who belonged to the ruling class were also regularly addressed as citizens. So in civic practice, the question of citizenship was therefore not one that was demarcated by our modern biological differentiation of men and women. And it was not even demarcated by the question of political participation. What divided citizens from non-citizens was status, which in turn was determined by hierarchical positionings in a network of family relationships. So with status, I mean what the Germans call Stand, L'état. And as cultural and legal historians have long argued, woman was not a legal or civic category of too much significance. So, coming to my conclusion. The relative dearth of gendered readings in the history of political thought is a consequence of a confusion as to where we look and what we expect to find. If we look for women conceived of as equals to men, both in the battle and in the Senate, we won't find them. But if we understand that the household was political and that women were then seen as sort of citizens and equal rulers, and in consequence that citizens were seen as wives, then, of course, we have opened up a world of politics inhabited by women. However, in this world was not inhabited by the woman. Early modern writers reflected on particular women, on wives, on queens, on ladies, on mothers, on daughters, on maids, on female slaves, all differentiated by very different status and very different roles. As historians, we know that political thinking of the past was not concerned with our concerns, or at least that it was constructed in a different way from our thinking. But regarding the gender relationship, this historical sensitivity has often been neglected in favor of the notion that the past had one single traditional or conventional way of looking at men in relation to women. In our quest to challenge essentialist ideas about men and women today, we might have forgotten to ask whether earlier centuries shared these essentialist ideas with us. Indeed, I argue that in some ways the past was less rigid than our present. I have tried to let early modern thinkers speak in their own terms in my book, but I'm aware that the questions that I was asking were modern ones. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that really fascinating talk. I fear that some of my criticisms have already been addressed in this wonderful talk, but I'll say them anyway. This is coming from a largely convinced reader, so thank you. So yeah, as Teresa said, I'm a DPhil student in history of political thought, and so I'm approaching these questions very much from the kind of let's study women in the history of political thought perspective that Anna Becker sometimes justly criticizes. So that's my perspective. I looked particularly at Mary Estelle, Catherine Macaulay, the 18th century, so it's a little bit later than Anna Becker's period, and so I think there's a lot of overlap between the way that people in politics thought about women, but there's also some differences, so I'll try to address those as well. So Anna Becker's wonderful and insightful book, Gendering the Renaissance Commonwealth, I think is at its core a study of what role gender played in this period. And as we've just heard, it played a very significant role. It's a fascinating and important book, I think, because it not only speaks to people who are already interested in gender in the history of political thought, but it also speaks to scholars who are just interested in Machiavelli or Aristotle or Baudin. And I think as such it's important because it can sort of speak to a very broad audience about this important topic, which is often neglected, I think. The book is very rich in its very detailed discussions on, for instance, Machiavelli, on political friendship, and Baudin on marriage. And it's tying these discussions of what we traditionally think of as the political all the time to things we see as belonging to the private sphere, such as family and specifically marriage. I think that one of the most important contributions to the book, which have greatly inspired me, is that it casts doubt on, and I quote, the narrative of women as civic outsiders and men as civic insiders, end of quote. And this is a pervasive narrative, both by people who are studying gender in the history of political thought and people who are skeptical about this project. And so the thought is something like, if women simply weren't part of the political, then that's a good argument for not having to look for women in politics, right? But the early modern period challenges this view. So women were excluded, although maybe not in Florence, but overall in the early modern period, I think women were excluded from formal politics in the sense of not being counted as citizens, in the sense of not holding any political rights that not all men, but some men did have. And in my research too, I see that Estelle and Macaulay were excluded in this sense, but they were very much included in another sense as well. Their political and polemical writings were accepted and engaged with. Catherine Macaulay was admired to the extent that, statues were being made of her in Bath. So it seems wrong to say that they were simply excluded, and exclusion seems much messier than that. Along these lines too, as Anna Becker has said, in the political thought of the Renaissance period, the category of women, which, as she has just said, was often thought about in terms of wives, queens, ladies, or daughters, or mothers, were not excluded from the political sphere owing to their biology, just as men were not included because of their biology. And so while the book does show, I think, very persuasively that women, the category of women or female, were included, I wonder how this sits more generally with the exclusion of actual embodied women at the time. And so I take your point that some women did count as citizens, but I do think that maybe in France, for instance, or in other countries at the time, there feels some tension between, in political thought, people accepting women, the category of women, as a fair category in politics, and actual women being excluded nonetheless. I also grapple with this in my own research, where Estelle and Macaulay are often seen as these rare exceptions to their sex, and so the fact that men admired them as political writers did not necessarily change their view of women in general, did not mean that they started respecting women as political agents generally. And so I wonder, in the same way it seems that while Machiavelli and Baudin, for instance, might attach value or importance to the category of women, and perhaps this is more so for Baudin than Machiavelli, was this further reflected in their actual valuing of women in politics? And if not, how does gendered political theory relate to actual inclusion and exclusion? And so related to this, I wonder about the sort of the verb of gendering political thought. What does it really mean to say that a period's or a thinker's political thought is gendered, I wonder? Does it characterize their thought as sort of inflected by gender attitudes, or is it a more neutral observation about everything being gendered, including politics? And if the latter, then I feel like you've already addressed this in your talk just now, but I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit on why it's so important to uncover the gendered thought. And then furthermore about the gender as a verb, which I find really interesting. And it seems that there's sort of a distinction between gendering as a scholarly undertaking, so that you're doing the kind of active gendering of thought, or that you're kind of recovering thought that was already gendered. And I wonder if you are pursuing both, or if you're doing the one or the other, and if so, why? And to illustrate this a little bit further from the book, I'll zoom in a little bit on Jean Baudin. In the book, you argue that for Baudin, as for others, in part through the institution of marriage, the political was gendered and the category of women was accepted or included in the political. But what does that inclusion mean if for Baudin, as you also argued in your talk just now, and I quote, "The paterfamilias had the full right to decide over life and death of children and wife." This might even cast doubt on the fact that Baudin really saw the category of women as central to politics rather than just marriage. I do, of course, concede that you try to show that Baudin was a kind of exception in his time, whereas he's often seen as, someone who's sort of an example of how everyone thought at the time. So I appreciate that that's what you're doing, but I'm just wondering why Baudin is such a big protagonist in the book, kind of. I find, for instance, the gendered aspect of Machiavelli, although seemingly an outlier, a kind of radical departure from Renaissance thought, more compelling, because it seems to entail, like you alluded to, a kind of real respect for female political agency. And on your view, which I find very persuasive, Machiavelli posits that women possess certain political skills, which are similar to the force of fortuna, as you just said, and which plays a huge role in his political thought. And I wonder whether you could elaborate a little bit on these different kind of genderings of their political thought, and whether some avenues of gendering political thought are more worth pursuing than others, perhaps. And I think one of the really fascinating insight that you offer in your book is that looking at gender in the history of political thought does not always mean looking at women. As you put it, and I quote, "Often gender is simply taken to be another word for women." Another quote, "Concentrating on the woman question and focusing on women's exclusion from politics and political thought does not let us see gender relationships when they were in plain sight." And it's interesting that in your book you show that you can perfectly well study gender without looking at any sort of female thinkers or women philosophers. But I'm wondering, sort of a natural thought might be, if we're studying gender in Renaissance political thought, to look at both male and female thinkers, for instance. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on your sort of case study selection. And additionally, while you're critical of sort of the study of women, it does seem understandable why historians interested in gender have focused on women, right? Because there's an abundance of male thinkers in the canon, and very few, if any, women are truly included in the canon of history of political thought. And so I wonder if you can elaborate a bit on how you think this focus on women has obscured these kind of important gender relationships. And my research, of course, is a study of women. But I am also critical of a lot of studies of women that have focused solely on feminist aspects of their thought, to the sort of neglect of other really interesting aspects of their thought. And so For instance, Catherine Macaulay is often considered next to Mary Wollstonecraft because they were contemporaries, and it's often seen as a shame that Catherine Macaulay wasn't as feminist as Mary Wollstonecraft. Even though Catherine Macaulay was the more famous one and influenced politics far more in her time, I would say, than Mary Wollstonecraft. So I agree that there seems to be something that seems to be going a little bit wrong sometimes in the study of women. But I do think that it's been a reaction against, centuries of feminist thought not being included. And so I wonder if you can elaborate a bit more on your kind of critique of this kind of study. I'd be interested to hear. And then finally, we've been focusing on the question of gender in quite narrow terms of male and female. And what is also fascinating, I think even more neglected than just women in the history of political thought, is, and I'm a bit inspired by Finn Mackay's talk last week, the concept of female masculinities and feminine, male femininities, if I may say that, in the history of political thought. And so, for instance, the fact that the women who were at times included in politics were often seen as sort of very masculine women. For instance, the sort of being able to use your intellect to that extent, to be counted as a philosopher or a historian, people were often seen as very masculine, and masculine women, which is why they were accepted. And so I wonder if these kind of, female masculinities or male femininities play a role in the gendering in the Renaissance period as well, or whether the gendered nature was truly about male and female only. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. But obviously, so Geertje has presented many questions for you and many challenges. But I also, we'll allow you to respond. But also, I think we could maybe just respond in the form of a conversation as well, because one thing that struck me in listening to your talk, reading your book, and also engaging with Geertje's work is, to the extent, I think there's a bit of a danger where those of us who want to reopen these questions of gender and history of political thought are maybe initiating or inaugurating a kind of matricidal moment of our own. Mm-hmm. So I'm sort of wondering, how we should understand what we're doing in relation to what great sort of scholars before us have done, like Harold Pateman, Susan Oken, Jean Alstein, Patricia Springborg. On the one hand, because for me, I like to kind of come out swinging. I'm a kind of, hopefully not just a pugilist. But these ideas. How should we acknowledge their work and acknowledge their debt, but also not spare them criticism? Because I think partly what's going on here is that you think that there's much to criticize.
And I think actually not really, but no. It's for me not so much a question of, I have to no, I have to start. Let's start differently. But yes and no, and I think the operative word is and. So I think when you just, there are so many good points, but. So, of course, we know that women are excluded from politics, and we know it still, and my book was not to say, women, you're perfectly fine, you are included, look, as wives you should be so happy. No, it's both, so I think both things are true. On the one hand, the history of political thought you have to study women as being excluded, and you can study them as being included. And it's very important for us to see that these aspects belong together. And maybe the question is, okay, but on what grounds are they excluded? And that is, I think, for me so interesting, because our narratives are so, it's so easy to say, and you said this as well in your talk, well, women are not political players, they are excluded, therefore why do you study them in the history of political thought? This is also what I encountered when I started with this. And so from this point of view, from just fighting against this story that there's nothing to women than exclusion, I think it's very important to show on what grounds they were included. But that, on the other hand, doesn't mean that they are not excluded, particularly now. So I think one very interesting avenue in how to think about that is to wonder at what point are they properly excluded, and what point do we start thinking women are excluded, biological women are excluded, and very often the culprit is the 19th century. I would really like to, I've started to actually write this project, finding out sort of what happened in the 19th century that transforms what I think a very diverse way of looking at different women in early modern times, to the idea that woman is, be it in law, biology, politics, the household, is one single category that embodies every person of the male sex, right? But this happened not in, and that is what I'm arguing against. This didn't happen maybe in the 16th century or the 17th century, maybe, but it might have happened in the 19th or 20th century. There something happened. And so I think what I try to argue against is the story of this long, unbroken tradition of exclusion of women, because that also brings us to this, to the here now, where women get told, well, you're only included for like 50 years. You should be really happy where you are, because nobody could ever think about equality, and then the 20th century comes along and all of a sudden you are professors, just be happy. Or you're politicians, you're a German chancellor, why are you not happy? But what I wanted to show in my work is that for 3,000 years we could also, some thinkers were able to include women. Yeah. Right? And that is to me so interesting. That and that then ties into your matricide. I always want to show that people were able to think about equality. People were able to think about inclusion. And then it always seems as if this never happened. So I found this amazing quote by Hedwig Dohm, who is one of the famous 19th century women's rights people, and she wrote in the late 19th century, in terms of the woman question, I find myself being like a ruminant cow, right? Because and I think this is also what I find, every generation of scholars, we all see that there had been a feminist movement in the past, a feminist movement, a movement that on equality, thinkers that thought about the equal relationship of the sexes. It has all been there, and we rediscover it, and then we forget it, right? And I mean, Plato already was able to talk about the equality of women, as I said, and then I have all these questions from all these examples from the 16th century where they thought about the equality of men and women, and so I think this is for me the interesting thing, and this is where I come from. This to show we have a tradition, so there is something going on. There's something going on because we have this tradition to think of women as equal partners in some sense, and then we forget this again. It's really interesting to read. To read Simone de Beauvoir, who also starts with Christine de Pizan, for example, and then today we think we have rediscovered Christine de Pizan, and it's all these things that feel, where I feel, and if we think about the Renaissance and equality and gender, I mean, Jakob Burckhardt, who founded in a way the Renaissance studies, writes that in the Renaissance women and men were equal. So it's always this sort of same trope, and I just wanted to make sure that we don't forget. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And so I think, but I never want to say that we shouldn't study the exclusion of women. I just want us to be more contextual. I just want us to show exactly on what ground were they excluded. And to your point with Baudin, that I indeed argue that Baudin includes women, but I then also say, but what does that inclusion mean? It means in a way nothing. So what does it mean so we have to think about it. What does it mean when people are included in the citizen body or excluded? It might not mean this. Inclusion might not be a very positive story, and exclusion maybe might not be so negative in some senses. Not that I think that the exclusion would, but I just think we have to just be very. I just want us to be precise, because I think in this lies then these nice discoveries that we can make.
But it seems that there is a respectful but kind of submerged criticism of some of kind of earlier generations of historicizing scholarship. I mean, again, so just I noticed that sort of the fixation on the 17th century as, you know, the sort of fateful moment in Pateman's Sexual Contract, right? And I agree with you that so much of this is actually going in the 19th century, which is why I don't study the 19th century. But also just the worry that, and I want to put this point sort of maybe carefully and put it to Geertje, which is a worry that perhaps a kind of an earlier generation of scholarship was sort of an avowedly activist scholarship that sometimes got in the way of recovering the kind of fine-grained distinctions and the particulars of the argument that you're talking about, Anna.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I don't think there's necessarily needs to be a tension between being an activist and being a scholar, but I do think that sort of the real kind of feminist agenda behind recovering women's political thought sometimes obscures the fact that there are amazing women who were involved in politics who were not feminists. But why are we?
What?
Yes, it's crazy, but they are out there. One of the things that I do in my research is try to argue, for instance, for Catherine Macaulay, who I think, you know, has some feminist tendencies, but is often excluded because she's not feminist enough. Is, you know, we're studying all these men in the, you know, if any undergrad students here have done Plato to Rousseau, not many of those are feminists. And so the thing that I wonder is, why do women need to be feminists to be included in the canon, whereas men can get away with, you know, all sorts?
I mean, I think, to me, just to this point, so this is why I said earlier, no, but because I really appreciate that feminist impetus, and I think, for example, Carrie Pateman, I think the sexual contract, what she's doing there, is still as valid, because she basically says what I also like elaborate in the book. It was never about fathers, it was always about husbands, it was about the domination of husbands over wives, and it was actually their domination in a sexual way that embodied everything. So I think her, so in that sense, I'm so sympathetic to her project. But then I'm also a historian, and I think my criticism is more that the people who came before us, and who I greatly appreciate and admire, Carol Pateman, Jean Bethke Elstein, Susan Moller-Okin, they were more political philosopher, and I think I'm a historian, and I just want to be, I'm interested in the history of it. The argument as well, but it needs to go together. And so I think my work, I think what differentiates it is my historical lens, that I want to contextualize it. So I'm very Cambridge schooly in that way. But my criticism is, of course, that even the contextualists they can contextualize everything, but they don't contextualize the gender relationship. That just seems to be a constant. And that is sort of what and this is also then why I studied these Machiavelli and Baudin, because they figure so hugely in our story of the modern state. And I actually think one should study women, but I wanted to say, look, this is mainstream. This is what your great heroes were talking about. And your great heroes are talking about gender, right? And so this is where, so I wanted, and then, I always think, but this should be the canon. Why is this is the canon? So the canon reads it, right? So, and then you end up being, again, sort of an outliner. But my impetus was always just to make a contribution to the canon. But in order so that we then can study women as well, women authors as well. And I think that is a really good criticism, and maybe if I would write the book now, I would try to include more women, but for the 16th century it's a bit difficult, and therefore I also think we should look at who do we include. So we won't find canon female writers in the 16th century, but we will find I found interesting treatises now of a woman who wants to be a gynecological doctor in the 16th century, and she writes this, it's Manteuffel, and she writes this, this long treatise on defending women as doctors, and then defending women in the general, women as active citizens there as well. But we have to therefore go into the archives or into the rare book, not archives, but into the rare book room.
But it seems like what's important when you try to study sort of any neglected figures, whether they're women or not, is to be more flexible about genre. I think that's really important, to sort of look at different kinds of sources that we wouldn't really think of as sort of traditional political theory, but they still are very political, so yeah.